It's my pleasure to introduce Ben van Berkel, who is part of the last conversation of this series for this year. I want to do a little bit of introduction of Ben, which it really doesn't need an introduction, and also I want to give you a little bit of feedback about what do I want to touch on the conversation, and we'll see where we go. So I'm going to introduce Ben. Ben is going to speak for roughly around half an hour, and then we're going to have a conversation. If I understand correctly, he's going to show only one project, which already is a declaration of confidence. I mean, as you know, architects tend to show a lot of stuff, so this is already, we are off to a good start. But what I want to mention about Ben van Berkel and the work of Unit Studio is what is interesting to discuss. It has to do, of course, with their design ethos and design ambitions as an architect, but also I want to talk about another aspect of it, which is Ben and his team, they have an amazing and extraordinary capacity to adapt and mutate how the practice operates and establishes itself in relation to a larger context of issues. And this is an ambition that many architects have, but not many can pull it off. And I would argue that Ben is one of those who have that capacity. And the other aspect is, I think Ben is an architect in the full sense of what the word means, in the sense of negotiation, the conventions and the tradition of the discipline, but also always looking to the future. He has an amazing capacity, and I think he was one of the true pioneers in the early 90s and middle of the 90s to put together what at the time seems to opposite camps, the idea of external forces defining the quality of architecture versus the idea of the interiority of the form making. And I think Ben and UN Studio and Caroline and all the people who have been part of his team, they tried to breed and develop a different take on it, which in many ways went to the roots of with some of the origin of modernism, but in a very contemporary way. And I think this is important to point out because in the dynamic of academic research and evolution of technologies and all that, we tend to forget some of the people who anchor these problems in a particular time. And for sure, Ben, through the work and books and many things, were a critical part of this. So in many, many ways, they always have an interest that always go out of the discipline, goes out of the profession, and come back and reshape and reorganize. So in a way, they can think about all these notions, and they reinvent their office and their practice on a regular basis. But at the same time, they can go and be ultra-specific and ultra-designy into the most basic root of the problem. So in many ways, one could argue that there are certain people who have that capacity to keep changing and mutating to remain coherent in a different way. So I'm not saying that Ben is David Bowie. For sure, there is a hair difference there, to say the least. But there is something about that which I would say it goes beyond the notion of the virtuoso or chess, the auteur quality of an architect, and to think more as an editor or to think in a way that have the capacity to absorb all the changes that involve the relation to the discipline. So in any way, I think in that sense, this is an interesting way to approach the work. And one of the things I'm going to be asking him and I want to talk about, it has to do a little bit with intersection between architecture as a cultural practice, but also in the relation with architecture as a force of economics and in the relation how we operate with the business. There is a whole dimension today, and as always, that we keep asking ourselves what an architect is, what architecture should be. And I think in many, many ways, every architect defines it a different way, and I think Ben has a peculiar one. So before I invite Ben to come and talk, I wanted to show this clip, which I think is really cool about the problem of what is being an architect.
If I see her, what do I say that I'm doing here in the building?
You came to see me. I work in the building.
What do you do?
I'm an architect.
Oh.
I'm an architect.
Have you designed any buildings in New York?
Have you seen the new addition to the Guggenheim?
You did that?
Yep. It didn't take very long either. What about architects, Stephen?
He's into architecture.
Hey, just like you pretend to be.
Let me be the architect. I can do it. Look, why couldn't you make me an architect? You know I always wanted to pretend that I was an architect. I'm an architect.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, what do you design?
Railroads.
I thought engineers do that.
They can.
You.
Anyway, Ben van Berkel, an architect.
So yeah, what is the role of the architect? You know, it's sometimes even important to pretend that you are an architect when you are seeing the next client, because you always have to convince, you always have to make sure that that you can argue for the next possible invisible of that what is not yet designed and built. So you have not to pretend, but you have to convince, particularly, that you can do that. And this particular project, the Arnhem train station, is a very good example of a 20 years work, but is recently finished, where I'm going to talk about tonight. And I wish I could talk for longer than an hour, but I forced myself to keep it short and to talk about the aspect of stretching the qualities of the way how we can look differently today to the phenomenon of a station. So let's call it stretching the type. And maybe if we think about mobility in general, we are mostly lately in transit, even if it is virtual transit. It can be slow, it can be rapid, it can be invisible, it can be disruptive, or life and living patterns around life are faster and became more wider reaching. And there are beautiful examples of the resilience of traveling, like this shot or this drawing from from somewhere. This was in the 19th century. Well, in Holland, the first roads were, or what they call the iron roads, were built, and in this case, they had to build it around a location of an owner who didn't want to give up his ground. But of course, after a while, the rail company became more powerful and was able to make the iron road straight through the place because they could buy the ground. And this phenomenon of resilience and clients who have a particular kind of political, economical power, and that's, I mean, also coincidental that Hernan wants to talk about it tonight, because we didn't really discuss it. I would like to discuss here as well, because what you see here on the left-hand side is that how I approached the station when I was first asked to look at the infrastructure of the location around the train station. There were only 2 bus stations on the front part of the station. This was the entrance tunnel going towards the different platforms of the station. There was a station actually what was far too small. I will go into that briefly later. But our argument was that if you looked at the amount of people moving between the 2 bus stations and moving around a bicycle parking and an entrance to a potential car park underneath the side, we argued towards the train station people that if you look at the amount of people moving around this part of the location, then that amount of people are higher than the amount of people moving from the train station towards the city center. And argued with that it was important not to look at the ground value alone of the train station area itself, where the train company wanted to build their own station, but we argued for an integral transfer location whereby all these different capacity of infrastructure could be combined into one gesture. And over the time, we had to come up with the most advanced, detailed arguments towards the politicians of the city, because the city was really after a transfer hub or a transfer location whereby they could follow, because of European subsidies and also government subsidies from Holland, they could intensify the ground around the stations, because that was the argument for a long time, to find ways to renovate these stations who were far too small in their capacity, but also, and we can see that a lot in Europe, and maybe we know it also here in America, because also these train stations became, over the last 50 years, became the backyard of the city. And they wanted to improve and rethink that aspect of the areas around the train station. So by arguing that there were more people moving around this part of the train station, we came up with the argument together with the politicians that people are more important than ground value, and that the amount of people going to the train area would actually help them to generate an economical strength in developing an integral station. And of course, I mean, through this argument, the train people, the company became far more interested in integrating that, because they saw the advantages of linking, of course, this intensifying of the infrastructural entities on the front side of the station. They saw that as a further possible potential development for their own train station. And they liked the idea of a transfer machine, of a transfer location, what could be again uplifting. And of course we came up with many references from the Grand Central station for instance, in New York, towards many other stations where the uplifting experience of traveling is embraced. And this idea of embracing the train station and going back to maybe an earlier industrial phenomenon, to be brought back into a new light, was for them something that they had not thought of before. So for that reason, we were able, in the end, to make a total new transfer location with an enormous amount of differential programs to be combined on a very small ground, only a 40,000 square meter ground, whereby we were intensifying it with close to 160,000 square meters on this site. And I'll explain later how we did that. But you see here the transfer part of the train station, the trolleybus station, a local bus station and a regional bus station underneath this office part. There are some residential parts related to the whole master plan of the location. And these are the platforms connected towards the tunnel underneath the train station. Another part of the development of the arguments of the politicians was that Arnhem needed to become an important hub again between the two economic areas. The one is the Ruhrgebiet in this part of Germany, and the Randstad of Holland. And you have to understand that Arnhem, you probably know that as well here quite well, is that Arnhem was as heavily bombed as Rotterdam and had to restart its city from the 50s on to develop itself quite intensely. But of course, in their planning, they did many things wrong, like what similarly happened in some places in Rotterdam. But to become a new center in the European map of a high-speed train link to all these parts of Europe were for them a very important part to be an essential part of. So one of the ideas, what we introduced for this idea of the intensifying ground, was to think of where we would have slow program in the location, so where one could work and where one could have the residential area, and where one would have quick program, as we called it. And by this clockwise planning of the location, whereby in the morning, the afternoon, and also in the evening, you would have activities there, we could make the location very lively. And that was going totally against the whole phenomenon of every station in Holland, because most of the stations, if you came out of them after 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the evening, then they were unsafe. Not many people would move around. And with the intensification of programming the site all connected towards the entities I mentioned, we could make the site far more lively. But that meant that we had almost 8 different or even more different clients on one location. And over 20 years, you have to imagine that caused an enormous amount of intensity and trouble of the way how we planned the project. And we had to develop for that resilient strategies and interesting new geometrical ways of connecting the project with each other, so that it could be flexible over these 20 years if we had to change certain parts of the program. For instance, the parking phase 1 and 2, the transfer hall, as I talked about, and the 2 bus stations towards the office towers and all the other programs had to be so well connected that the puzzle would come quite fluently together in the whole organization of the project. And for that we invented what we call design models, design tools for combining all these different complex layers within the section of the site. So the section is more important, as you can imagine, in such an intensifying ground than the plan. And for that we introduced these V-walls in order to make the column system of the parking and the column system of the bus station and the offices, to make them all squeeze into one system, because they all needed another construction system, whereby it was possible through these V-walls to make an incredible span of a wide span of spaces where we could always change the programs. Even we could introduce housing in the office spaces here, because we have a span of close to 22 meters. So daylight could come deep into the parking area, as you can see here. Not only the daylight, but also fresh air could come into the lower part of the building. And as I said, we could work quite flexibly with the whole system of these V-walls while we were layering the building site over time. And of course, the whole infrastructure of moving from the parking area towards the bus station, towards the train station, towards the offices were all possible through these, you could call it also the infrastructural areas, in between this construction of the V-walls. But what was here the most essential was that we worked with these tools, as I said. The stretching of the digital became, for this project in the mid-90s, you have to imagine, we started with this project, quite important. And then, of course, we were not scripting yet. We had not the opportunities to work with 3D modeling techniques, although we were testing, we were researching the potential and the possibilities of it, of how we could connect it towards the development of this project. And many strategies came up out of this research, this is a diagram we later used in a project in the late 90s for research on the area around the Penn Station, and used the strategy of all what we did around the Arnhem train station. So we looked at the different user groups. We looked at the way how the different user groups on the site were using what kind of for particular infrastructure, like if they used the buses, if they used the trains, or if they used the car, and then we looked at the different time zones they were active in on the site, and how they would access the site, or where they use, for instance, the public areas. But in this, what in that time maybe was not yet called parametric design, what we developed and discovered in this strategy was that we wanted to connect all these meshworks of information. We wanted not collect the information, I better say. We didn't want to collect it. We wanted to connect the information with actors in the network, whereby the V-walls, as I explained, became a part of the tooling system of developing the whole site. Then there was another part related to the way how we worked with the movement of the landscape of the site, because there is a change in height on the site, and we cut the landscape so that we could make the entrance towards the car park and the bicycle parking area in the landscape. And then there was this mathematical model where we were fascinated in, because on the higher level of the site, we could pull the people in from the city into the station, and from the same time, we could pull them from the train station up to a higher level through the area of the roof of the site into the city. And then, of course, then there was this twist, the central integral constructive column, what brings all the forces together in this transfer hole in the middle of the location, the void of the location, one could say. And these three elements, they are physical tools. They're bringing the information of all the complex aspects of the whole project together. They were the four ambitions of there where we could actually make the project work with. They're not intellectual, they're not theoreticals in the sense of that they are more sculptural and object-oriented in order to connect information and bring it so together that it can connect a wide range of complex information. But other tools we used was, for instance, that we used the flows of movement on the site in a channeling diagramming technique. So what you see here are all these different user groups being diagrammed in a way whereby they were then be connected in these volumes, as you can see in this image here. So this is the train station part of the location, and this is the bus station. These are the two bus stations. This is the movement of the people moving to the city, and these channeling systems, these volumes of movements, these flows, had an open area where we could place the column, so that if you would move into the train station, that you would have no obstacle, a visual obstacle, so that you would always see where you would move to, and that you would have the opportunity to use the architecture for wayfinding, and that we would almost not have any signs within the transfer hall to move from one part of the location towards another part. So although these diagrams are developed in the mid-90s, they gave an incredible influence to the whole development of the project. And we've developed it further into the way how then this central column could play with the idea of the visual views, but also with the way how they could guide the people and how they could be oriented towards the destination of the infrastructure where they had to go to. And of course the play of geometrical service, where we were for a long time already interested in. For instance, the phenomenon of the Seifert service, you know this phenomenon probably well. It's a mathematical model whereby the edges of the surface are the strongest. And many experiments have been done in the 60s with these Seifert surfaces, with soap bubbles. Maybe you've seen these experiments, whereby the forces move along the edge from quite large spans you could make with these cipher services. And this is what for a long time we have experimented later on, and also in between the 20 years we were working on Arnhem, is that we discovered that cipher service and mathematical service in general, from not only the Möbius structure we worked with, but also other mathematical services, that they can take up an enormous amount of forces and can take, for that reason, a span in this case of almost 65 meters on one side, and on the other side a span of 35 meters in one gesture. So that meant that we could work with a column or a gesture of a column, what could take up this enormous amount of energy into one move in the central part of the station. And of course then the digital production of it was the most fascinating in the end, because we, like with the Erasmus Bridge, we were first going for concrete and then discovered that we could make the project easy in steel, because we could make it in better segments and larger details, and manufacture all these larger details on different locations, and could build this last part, what was actually, of course, the most intense and most expensive part. We could build it in a very, very quick manner, and that meant that we could reduce with that an enormous amount of cost in the production of this project. And we liked the elegance in the sense of the gesture of the forces going in the steelwork more than when we would have had to do it in concrete, because then the structure would be quite more volumetric. And then, of course, through the development of the production of the project, we suddenly discovered that, of course, with the way of how these services came all together, the forces really worked quite well through these edges, as I mentioned before, in these services. But the most important aspect is not what we achieved with the object of the station itself alone, but particularly what it could do. And as I said, in this panoramic picture, as you come from one part of the train station, or one part of the bus station, and you move into the central hall, you can see immediately where the taxis are, or where the train station is, or where the bicycle parking is, or the entrance to the car park, etc. So there is almost no signing here necessary to find your way in a train station. And for many reasons, this was heavily promoted by many clients, because they not liked only the fact that the architecture was helping and supporting the wayfinding, but particularly also for many other reasons like safety, etc. But a third aspect was that it also guided through the openings in the roof. It guided the people towards the way how they could walk towards the light, and where the light was connected towards the entities and the openings of the entrances of the infrastructure. But again, we were in these 20 years having the opportunity not to build here the first complex mathematical service. As I said, we had tested it in many other projects, and in a serial manner we were able to see if it was possible to either or work with it in concrete, what we did actually, like for instance in Graz, in the music theater in Graz, we could make this quite complex twist. We could make it in concrete, but we had to pump up the concrete from below. So we didn't pour the concrete from above into the side, but pumped it up so that we would have not any gravel in the concrete on the lower part of the concrete. And well, we know of course the Villa Arnhem and the Mercedes-Benz Museum. So in a serial manner, we were able to stretch the opportunities of the knowledge coming into this project. And I last time when I was here, I talked a lot about the knowledge strategies we've developed in Young Studio, and maybe we could talk about it also later. But this is what we do. We maybe as architects, we are not able to, in a serial manner, like artists, paint and build one building in 2 or 3 places. But what we can do is we can take a larger detail and test it over many places without having the disturbance of that as a repetition in the work for the total image of architecture. But at the third part of what I would like to explain here is that the most important is the experience of the way how this station came all together, because it is a master plan on the one hand, but it became also a station that celebrates in a way traveling. It uplifts it. I mean, we saw traveling as a way of walking in curves whereby one can see each other. Like maybe talking about the resilience of the first image I showed you tonight, a certain form of resilience is good. You walk around the edges of the train station here in order to look at each other. So my argument has always been that if you walk in a curve, you can always look back to the people, you can look back to the road where you came from. And you can have a communication between public moments within the station, as if the station becomes almost a theatrical experience of traveling, and where the celebration of moving and departing and arriving becomes an aspect what is celebrated here. And the examples of this, early examples, this is a poster made for the opening of the Waterloo Station in London, and we see a similar kind of effect of all this public life, intensive life around the train station, and actually with some military forces even walking around the train station, because in that time, just after the war, train stations like today have to be safe. But this intensive liveliness we wanted, of course, introduce here as well with the gestures we introduced. So again, it's the object of architecture what is the most important to intensify and to maybe stretch the typology of the phenomenon of the station. But the most important is that you know how to stretch the experiences of architecture in order to make sure that it is not always a place where you just walk through, but that you like to come back towards it, and that you like to enjoy being in a place where you can wait and where you feel surrounded. So that's where I'd like to end. Thank you very much.
To start, and maybe I'm very aware that the first question, they have more than one part, is in many, many ways an unfair question in terms of how much architecture can do. But to keep with the topic of stretching that you introduced to talk about the project, I would like to start to talk about the stretch of time. Mm-hmm. Because has been a very long process. It has been 20 years since you guys won the competition until it got complete. And there is 3 parts I want to talk about in relation to a stretch of time. One is, first, and this is more the pure design architecture talk, is how you keep yourself interested and excited when a project takes so long, and how much change and mutation a project can take over that time. That's number one. The second one, it has to do with the changes of politics and economical budget and the economical situation in Europe in the last 20 years. So this probably produced a whole series of back and forth in how the project operates. And the third one, which is probably the most tricky because the recent issues, the recent events in Brussels and all that. How to deal with because your project in many, many ways has a huge sense of optimism. It has moments almost that convey the notion of dream and happiness of traveling, even like Sarin in TWA. There's certain qualities of that you mentioned to it, which is, probably with this, in many ways, the 90s was a certain level of optimism in terms of the promise of technology, all the things that are coming now into this geopolitical reality in which Europe, and particularly infrastructure transportation, are becoming almost like military zones in many, many ways. So again, it's an unfair three-part question, because I think it's one of the things that sometimes we ask the architecture too much, but maybe to start to talk about the kind of what happened in the back or in the kitchen of a project like this. It takes 20 years with the complexity of it.
Yeah, but you could say for architecture it's a long stretch, but for a master plan project in Europe it is a short stretch. So the two fighting here in a way together. In the time we were busy with the project, but maybe coming back to your first question is the reason why it was for us interesting is because there were so many challenges within the project developed, whereby we had promised ourselves so many unusual things to work with that we were never sure if they were able to be fully realized. Like the story of the Seifert surface and the twist, or the way how we could work with the V-walls. The essence was here to find a strategy to make sure that there was enough flexibility, like you said in you're asking your second question, what we need to control. So I was interested in that time in new forms of, or let's call it new concepts of control in design. Because in a way, you know that there was, especially in the 90s, it was quite difficult to work with some clients, whereby I can remember that, particularly in that time, you had clients who would come up with a plan of an office building or a residential project, or even a pre-engineered station where you just had to fill in the design because it was already infrastructural wise, it was already designed. So, and here that sometimes happened too. I've seen it also with the Erasmus Bridge. I mean, when we designed the Erasmus Bridge, then the engineers where I worked with, and there were almost 150 engineers I worked with, while I was designing the bridge, they constantly changed the angle and the tension in the bridge, because they said it was more powerful to take some material out of the bridge. But that anyway, I mean, so what I'm trying to argue here is that that through the years of political change, like there were so many different elements and political parties involved in the whole project, they believed always in the essence of the project, and also even where in the beginning the railroad company was not fascinated in the project because they thought they wanted to do their own station, they became slowly, after many years, so after 2-3 years, they became fascinated in the whole concept, because for them it was an idea what was linked to their philosophy of how to intensify public transport. And that was my, and with the politicians, the argument was, how can we intensify more people to use the public transport, and how could we connect them to its the intensive use of ground around the location. So this is what most of the politicians supported, luckily enough. Yeah, and then the third question about this whole phenomenon of safety and the difficulty of train stations today is what we have in airports as well. I mean, today every transport hub or every crowd area where we have to deal with crowd control is becoming far more complex to handle than ever before. But again, also here, you have to imagine you have within a rail company like this in Holland, you have almost 9 departments within in a company like that. One is looking at where the signs go, one is looking at the light, one is looking at how the platforms are organized. Now the company is looking at the safety, etc. You have to go through all these different departments to convince them that this is, for instance, a safe station. And they believed that the quality of this safety was there simply because you could overview everything so quickly. Because there were no columns in the station. They felt that was one of the most essential aspects of that, what they thought as being safe in the design. So that worked for a long time quite well. And that doesn't mean that we can fully protect all the difficulties we face today around the infrastructural parts of our society today, but yeah, that's how we survived it.
So let's assume for a minute that we were not in front of an audience and we are talking in a cafe. The first question will say, how do you convince them to give you this money to do this? This is a public building, this is a public entity, there is a lot of politics involved in it. And again, in a time that, again, Euro has gone through multiple economical shifts, how you manage, in other words, yeah, that's the funny part. But the other one is in terms of budget and control and organization. I can ask you how much you went over budget? You went over budget, the budget changed over, I mean, also how you plan in relation to that? Because it seems like
yeah, it
seems like a Titanic operation.
Yeah. Yeah, but you shouldn't. I mean, I can answer it almost with 3 words, and that's I am Dutch. I'm Dutch.
So Dutch client, Dutch architect.
Yeah, we are. We are educated to work with tight budgets on the one hand, and if there is somewhere space.
So you're saying that this was a tight budget?
Yeah, I mean, for you, I mean, hopefully you can see that actually in only, you could say, maybe 1/4 of the project is expensive, but the rest of the project is not so crazy. Like the construction of the V-walls was actually as efficient as when we would have to build many complex laid structure of diverse column systems. That was maybe even more expensive, was the argument of the contractor.
But in relation to that, for example, how you guys structure a team to work on that? In a way that there is the design aspiration, the instrumentation of the technical part, the budget control and so on. How you guys operate? I mean, how much you divide, how you work in relation with the consultants? Is something's all built into the system? Yeah,
that's what. But that's how you know us. I mean, we are not for nothing called United Network Studio. I mean, we believe in collaboration. We have always from the beginning, even when we do the first sketches of every project, we have all the specialists on board. Like the story of the wayfinding was connected to a specialist. Maybe you know him. He's called Paul Meixenaar. He's one of the top wayfinders in even here in America when it comes down to airports and the signages at airports. And he always said to me, Ben, make sure that you don't give me so much work, so that the architecture can do the wayfinding. So he came up with a particular kind of direction of a vision where I thought, well, I mean, that would be a quite incredible, interesting challenge. So I mean, you know that Cecil Belmont was involved in this project also, because I mean, I knew from the beginning onwards that.
Did he sue you? Because he sues everybody.
No, he didn't sue me. He knows that I'm Dutch. So no, I'm.
That's a good way to answer everything. I'm Dutch.
I'm highly pragmatic sometimes when it comes down to the way how we collaborate. We make clear contracts. And in a way, I'd like to collaborate with everyone who's sometimes in certain things better than myself. You know, that's what I'd like to do always in every process of every project.
Let me expand beyond this project. It's something that we talked the other day over the phone, but also we talk over the years. Because in many ways, I would argue from the pure disciplinary evolution of the work, there is a coherency that can be traced over the years.
Yeah.
But the way that you guys frame or package it, or for the lack of a better word, sell it, it changed over the years and very aggressively. How much is that dictated by your own internal desire, or it really comes from the idea to figure out a way to get away with murder?
I like your David Bowie reference. I don't know if I like the work of David Bowie also, you know, but I mean, you could see his work.
Before you answer, because you're one of the few guys, I will say, in our field that is completely unapologetic about that and almost don't feel embarrassed to talk about that. Like everybody else does it, but they kind of hide it. It's never upfront as part of the integral operation.
No, I
and you're very unapologetic about that. And I mean, that's why, again, nobody's watching. So I want to, I want to know really the thinking behind.
The thinking is simple, and that is that I, you know, my statement about who cares about the box or the blob, you know, who cares about it? I argue, let's celebrate and liberate any style. So let's think about the transformative qualities between what could be a more articulated blob-like architecture, or what could be a more kind of a more reductive type of architecture. So I'm interested in liberating any kind of stylistic reference. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in, for instance, in infrastructure. I'm interested in the way how you could rethink the movement in a building, or let's say, like for instance, I mean, the Mercedes-Benz Museum is one complex infrastructural node. But going back to why I'm unapologetic about it is simply because I believe that you, as an architect, you need to almost think as an artist. And that's why I like the reference towards David Bowie, because you know I would not refer maybe to David Bowie. I would refer to artists who were quite easy in the way how they transformed their ideas. I mean, there are many examples of artists who were quite comfortable moving from one phase to the next. And the most important example is, for instance, Picasso. I mean, he had almost 8 phases in his life. And architects are quite restrictive and quite I don't know, reductive sometimes on the way how they sell their work. They believe that it needs to have one image, and that's it. You know, it needs to or either be white, or it needs to either be, you know, having a particular clear reference. And I think that's not really necessary. And I think in architecture you have more possibilities, you have more opportunities. There are so many aspects where you can experiment with. And that's the way how I keep also for myself the work attractive. That was maybe also an earlier question. How do you keep yourself enthusiastic about architecture? And that I can do only by rethinking architecture constantly.
But then again, I mean, you say that, but then again, there is a formal language that I would not call a style, but there is an impronta that looks coherent over the years. So in a way, yeah, you have all this interest of in relation with it, but at the same time, there is a highly coherent formal language that is a permanent evolving. So,
but do you really see that? Because I mean, there is, like for instance, there is an.
I'm absolutely convinced about this. Like all of us architects, we think that each project that we're doing something different. And when the audience see it or the client see it, they can read that there is an evolution of it. I'm not saying this in a malicious way. I'm just saying it's always interesting to hear with people.
Well-
I mean, Tom is here sitting in the front row. He's another one that I have this conversation with him too. And he says, I'm not interested about this and so on. But at the same time, there is a very clear formal vocabulary that can coming across in each project. And of course, each project is different, and the variables and the forces and all that, it produce things. But I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. So how to negotiate that balance, it seems to me that's one of the major acts of the magic of being a good architect.
Yeah, no, I would never deny it that there is a reference to maybe, again, the serial in the work, the serial aspect. So you can group the work, like you know, maybe there was also maybe a blue period in my work. So in the beginning of the beginning of when I started in architecture. And then there is a period where I was interested in mediation, and it often had to do with for instance, friends or specialists or people who I work with. Like, for instance, I had a long period when I worked with Pipe Lotterist, you know, very good, wonderful friend of mine, good artist friend of mine, and she learned me to look at how you could work with the medium of light, you know, the medium of light, and she called it, how can you paint with the camera? And that time she was playing so much with painting with the camera in her videos. So that gave me interesting color again, and working with media facades. And look at the media facades. If you look at these buildings, then they don't have anything to do with the mathematical research I have done over the years in other buildings. So there is I mean, sometimes there are 3 or 4 particular layers of fascinations where I'm then into. And they sometimes are not to be followed after each other, but they coexist next to each other.
Let me move a little bit into the, I would say, the business side of things. Like, it's something that I think to me is one of the most actually current conversation that I think in a school need to start to happen more often. Yeah. Which is the alignment between the creative and intellectual ambitions in relation with the economical and the political aspect of pragmatism that any office need to go through. And I think in that sense, you and Caroline has been very clever and smart over the years, how you structure that. If this is something that it has been more reactive or proactive, in the sense like you try to construct models of, like, how often you guys readjust the business or economical operation of the studio in relation to the design agenda? Or they kind of operate independent and you guys find a way to make it work, or is more integral how you guys approach it?
Well, that's an interesting question. We almost change, I mean, there is no particular strict rhythm, but there is a phase of 3 to 6 years where we change the whole organizational model of the office. And that is not to do with that we think that is a good idea, but it is simply guided by research and design, or design guided by research. And like, you know, the whole development of the knowledge platforms within the RA, you probably know this aspect of the way how we work. We have all these different knowledge platforms within the organization. That was simply done because we discovered that we were developing so many ideas and so many qualities within the office, what was getting lost. And by grouping it and storing that information, and to make sure that we also would get subsidies for the research we did in order to do something new with glass, or to develop new forms of sustainable glass, then we developed, for that reason, these platforms. But that meant that we had to rethink the whole system of how architects were educated in the office. So what we did was that with every new intern or younger architect, you know, we call it the architect number 1 and 2, is that when they come after school in the office, they do 2 or 3 months pure research. And the reason why we do that is because they help us to store the knowledge, and to chapter it and to organize it, so that we don't invent in 3 or 4 locations within the company the same thing. But what we did a long time, because we were, and that made it, you know, so it was a kind of design strategy and philosophy of a way of how we had to again learn to control the company, because I mean now we are at 150, but over the years we were discovering that it was far more difficult to control the quality of the design as we wanted it, and by compartmentalizing it a bit more through research and knowledge platforms, then we could also make it a bit for the architects also more fascinating to move from one platform to the other, so that you create a kind of school or education system within the way how you develop the architects within the company. And this is what I always believe, that you, on one hand, you need to have architects who are specialists on the one hand, but you need to also have all-round architects. So by moving the architects through a clockwise learning system, there is also a future for them to develop their own knowledge. And maybe that helps them also to stay longer within the company.
When we talked the other day, you were mentioned that one of the things that you were interested in, like you're talking about stretching the type, stretching thinking things, you were talking about that architecture was moving now as a field, but also you were interested in the idea of to be an architect that operates on the level in which architecture kind of create new life conditions, or it changes the way that we live.
Yeah.
Would you like to elaborate on that? Because it was not clear to me what you were meaning by that.
I mean that like maybe what you will experience in the train station today. I mean, you have to go there in order to notice that, but you can be in many times at the same time while you're there and move around the station, because you can look at so many activities that it is as if you are in a time machine. And that's why maybe the reference of the time machine image was in there. So this idea of that you are in many times in the same time is dealing also with the idea of a time-space concept where I'm highly fascinated in lately. Because I mean we are in many times at the same time when we communicate today. You know, we are so into many worlds and so many other realities. Than the real reality where we are in today, sometimes when we are in one place. And I find this a new, interesting cultural phenomenon, what I definitely wanted to explore in architecture. I mean, you know, the classical phenomenon of modern architecture had to deal with the 2.5D experience of space-time, where Gideon talked about so well. And what maybe was picked up by Le Corbusier, but it was a kind of very linear model of a space-time experience, what is very, in a way, one-dimensional. And I'd like to make that experience far more richer, hopefully through this series of complex layers within the train station, whereby, like I said, whereby the train station becomes almost a theater, like where when you move into the theater, you step also in another form of reality. You know, you see a performance, and you are suddenly into a world what is not yours, and that is what I wanted to. And you know, maybe you know, this is an aspect of the way how I talk about space-time and a transit space. But we can maybe discuss also other kind of phenomena, you know, the phenomena of the way how we are educated today, or how we live today, or how we work today. I mean, all these phenomena are changing so intensely, and I think they're the most fascinating aspects of our culture, where we as architects can support or redefine how these spaces can be rethought and be reorganized.
There was a couple of things that in your presentation that popped my interest, in the sense you use the word control a lot. I mean, like you're interested in all mechanisms of control, but at the same time you put a quote of Grant Harman, and you mention objects a lot. which at first glance, one could argue that there's a kind of a contradiction there, because one of the arguments about the object autonomy of itself to be the itself is immune to any kind of mechanism of control that is external. But as I said in the introduction, to me, you're one of those architects and your office that it tried to negotiate between those two worlds.
Yeah.
So how that operate in your brain? I mean, and now I'm not talking, forget about practice and pragmatic and so on. I'm talking more from the conceptual point of view. How you negotiate those things, which again, I may be misreading that, but I would say at first glance, they seem like opposite strategies.
Yeah, they are. They are two totally opposite strategies. I mean, it's in a way how the
and you don't tell me I'm Dutch, so you cannot
No,
get
I'm
away
not
with
going
that
to
one.
say I'm Dutch. No, that would not fit. That one would not fit. But I link it maybe also to but I will explain it through, like for instance, I mean, look at the practice today. It's quite amazing how the profession has been stretched up also. You know, if you compare it to let's say, a century ago, we can now easily refer to fashion, literature, philosophy, art. Everything is possible how we refer to what kind of cultural effect in architecture very easily. And we can play with that in architecture very easily. And at the same time, on the other hand, I mean, if we talk about, let's say, more call it the harder side of the phenomenon of architecture, the object-oriented maybe aspect of architecture, that has been stretched up also enormously. What you can now do with the object, the amount of advices you need now around how you need to think about the new sustainable regulations, engineering regulations, especially in a global practice where we are enormous. So the profession, as I said, has been stretched up intensely. Before we would talk only about aesthetics and functionality. Now we cannot talk about it anymore. It's all about new forms of utility, and maybe let's call the aesthetic now cultural effects, something like that. So and so this aspect you can find also in the way how we approach architecture, and maybe what maybe Graham, sorry for not reading the quote, but Graham Harman calls, and everyone knows here about Graham Harman. I think you even invite him to be. Yeah,
he's now a professor here.
That's going to be great, because I think he will provoke you all a lot. But that what he calls the third table. You know, as everyone knows here, that the story of that the table doesn't exist only out of the particles and is only not there as an object itself, but it is also connected to that what it can do. It's not what he believes in alone. He believes in the opposites of these two qualities and calls that the third table. And I think that is, in a way, the essence of the way how we need to work as architects too. That it is not only the object and the phenomenon of the object alone, but particularly how you can intensify the object in order to make sure that it causes an enormous amount of after images and after thoughts. You maybe know that we did, talking about the table, actually maybe we did once a sit table. You can sit in the table.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, so
not that comfy.
Huh?
Not that comfy, I have to say. Good idea.
Well, you once, you sit with me on the table, yeah?
All right, we'll take one.
But the table is actually is not a table where classically you can work on alone. You can have a lunch on it, and I thought that it was doing many things what it didn't do in the end as I expected. So it was, especially bought up by younger startup companies, because they thought that the sit table was a fantastic integral object what they can use for all the activities in the office, so that they didn't have to buy 5 or 6 different furniture, but that this one table could do all the work for the meetings where they could work on, etc. And this is where I'm particularly fascinated in, so that you look at the intensification and the broader opportunities of what you can do to intensify the object in order to cause the effects and the impossible effects you couldn't predict.
Maybe we open to some questions from the audience. Somebody want to ask?
I have a question about inter-architecturality, especially that you talk about the 20 years that passed in the firm and the other projects that you've done, but maybe if you could talk also about your firm's relationship with other projects that are going on or that have happened, and whether the agenda of the firm changes throughout time, or whether you just celebrate the fact that there's a technique that works and a method that produces good buildings, and now it's just about producing more good buildings.
No, I thought it was clear on that level. It's not so that when I talk about the serial knowledge you can develop in the larger details of a project, that principle is then repeated and that it becomes a standard tool. As maybe what we discussed also, I would become quite nervous if I would start to become standard in my own behavior of working. I would not be able to work anymore, I'm afraid. So my hope is to keep on making sure that you make small steps. That's what I've always liked. That's why we produce a lot. Because I'd like not to make that sounds maybe unusual, but I've learned that if you test things out over 3 or 4 projects in the smaller or the larger details, then you suddenly can make a jump with your 4th project you do. And that's how I keep on, in principle, still doing it.
As designers, I think both of you played important roles in the advancement of the digital project within architecture. And yet...
Yeah, but he gets them built.
Yeah, fair enough.
I just want to point that out. I mean, it's not fair to Ben to put us.
You build.
But thank you.
Well, within that context, I mean, the only thing we know for sure is that software is going to keep changing, keep developing. And that's not to mention hardware. But I'm curious how important it is for each of you to keep up with these technical advancements in design software, or is it more a matter of delegating to a younger generation of designers within your practices, who you then advise and direct?
I mean, you can...
Sure. I really believe that software is a little bit like music that you like. At some moment in your life, your brain shut down, and you cannot absorb any new music that you really love. So I think software, you try to keep up conceptually. I think at least for me, it's very difficult to keep up with the day by day of the technical evolution of it, and I think that's okay. I mean, I think that's part of the problem, and also I think it changed again in my very little office. It changed also with the amount of time that you have to it. So for me, it's important that you understand what is the value of it and the potential of it. I'm not so sure. First of all, I think it's absolutely impossible to keep up with every new available tool that there is. And to be honest, at some moment, you have to become at the same time suspicious of the technology and try to challenge it and so on. So I think it's important to keep up. At least for me, it's important to keep up to know what is out there. But I kind of not try to keep up myself to be the guy who has the faster efficiency or speed with it. But
yeah, I think it is. Well, I mean, the advantage of a new tool, you are interested in of course, the digital, and you've also clearly showed it in your work. But the advantage of knowing the latest of a particular development is that you can also that you can try, or you can test it in the way how it can be transformed and be instrumentalized in your design. But I think I've said it here once before. You know, we as architects might think that we are in the iPhone phase, but the outside world, the building industry is still in the Walkman phase. So there is still a lot of education we need to bring to that world. And although I proved maybe here today that you can educate contractors to work with unusual software, and it's becoming better and better. Like the builder of the Arnhem train station was a shipbuilder actually. I didn't tell that, but I do believe in order to improve your software, you have to also do a lot of reverse engineering, as I like to call it. That from the building industry, and that what the potentials are of material production, that you learn how to apply that also to design, and not only that you don't only work in a projective manner alone, from design to the build form.
But one thing I will add is I really believe that you have and you must, as an architect who operates today, to deal with that. I mean, I really don't understand people who take pleasure and claim that we are not interested in that. I find that moronic.
Amen.
Hi.
So just a quick question, I mean, to sort of touch on what you were saying about Erasmus, I mean, do you find sometimes that in terms of both intellectual but also practical liability, if you're ahead of your consultants in terms of pushing construction or material logic, how do you cover that?
He's Dutch.
Right. No, but what's interesting to me about simulation, of course, is that it can work very well on the desktop, but it can fail in reality. So, do you have a practice in place for guaranteeing that the experiments don't fail? And is that what incrementalism is about?
Yeah. That's maybe what I meant about that you have to be careful to be too projective with the digital. And new tools and new techniques alone, that you have to test it with your specialist if certain things are possible. But I like it sometimes to talking about contracts, is that I'd like to discuss it with my client lately more in detail of who are the contractors we invite. So that they have these tools. Let's say, if we invite contractors who still have to invent on the spot on how to transform your 3D model, then of course you will lose an enormous amount of money. So I try to convince the client that digital progression and digital understanding from all the parties is necessary to get them involved in order to have an efficient process of working. So we place it in our contract, and that works better now over the last years.
We're not going to solve it tonight, but I think that is an interesting topic for a symposium about contracts. I would really like to have a conversation with a group of successful architects to talk about the different approaches to contracts and how much they get. I mean, I think it's a fascinating problem that, again, we tend to, which is fine in the school at some moment, that this level of reality is sometimes good to avoid it a little bit, but there is something fascinating about that in terms of how those protocols are completely redefining. Yeah. And I think this is one of the fundamental differences between the way that architects practice in Europe versus in America, in terms of the amount of the power that sometimes the American system allowed to surrender, the architects surrender, which the Europeans in that sense are much more aggressive in protecting, and how they control, again, the word control of the whole process, I think it's a fascinating discussion to have one of these days.
But you know, and I think I've said this also before here, is, you know, when I talk about control, it's not anymore that I argue for control what is a classical form of control, you know, that you stand in front of the orchestra and it's meandering through the orchestra, like so rethinking that model needs also other ways of convincing every form of risk, and also yourself, because, you know, I've had many situations where luckily enough I've never been, I should touch wood, I've never been in court, but as an architect, you know, it's so...
You're starting to build in America?
Yeah.
It will happen. Sorry to tell you.
I know not many friends who had trouble in America, but I think it is a matter of also who are the people who help you to advise you there. Yeah, there was a gentleman there.
I was just wondering how you brought the team together, your clients, your team of consultants, engineering consultants, how the contractors were selected and what criteria was used to select the contractors, and how you worked together as a team. How did you bring that team together? How did you work together? And how did you define success as a team?
Oh, you know, I have a very strict rule on that level, is that if we are not able in every design meeting, so from the beginning of the project till the end, to come up with the clear solutions whereby, like for instance in an end of a process where maybe the client asks for a 10% reduction on the project, that I am not the only one who is responsible, that we share that responsibility, and this is maybe where I believe in strongly, that you share responsibilities together, and that you stand behind the total thinking of the project, like maybe how theoretical some of the aspects of the topics we discussed today. There are some highly pragmatic arguments to be made also in why we could convince so many parties to go into one direction in this quite complex puzzle of a project. But we had also difficulties there, and like some of the tenders, one tender failed, for instance. That's a really, if you have a failing tender for a big part of the project, then that causes often a delay of a year in Europe. So we had to win that time back, and that is what the client asked us. What could we find in order together to win that year back in time? Yeah, and again, what I said, it is a matter of how you, with the lawyers from all the parties, because that is what is now, I mean, I know that is in America quite normal, that you all have a lawyer next to you, but I argue often that the lawyers are not allowed on the table before we have finished the building. And that they can, at the end of the process, then they can start to fight with each other about who was failing in the process and who can get some claims. But I had a, for instance, in Mercedes-Benz project in Stuttgart, whereby in the first 5 months already 5 lawyers on the table were saying that everyone was not in time with the drawings or whatever. And luckily enough with the client we could send these guys out. And that helped an enormous amount in order to speed up the process. And everyone became happier and happier.
Any other question? There's one here.
Hi. You do political agents from all around the globe. What is like for you the most important? What is for you the most important factor that like in the decision maker? What for you is the most important characteristic in the decision maker, like in globally speaking, that can help to actually make the project work?
Do you remember that I said somewhere that these larger details, like the 5 elements or the 5, call it the 5 design tools, that they were the binders of the whole project. They melted as actors in the network, all the knowledge together, and they were, and for that reason, the most important decision makers within the process of the design. And how I make the decision, or when and which moment, is a very difficult question to answer, because it's a kind of gut feeling often. I cannot describe it. I often argue or say to my team, yeah, this will work. You know, when it works, then it is. Then you make the decision. You know, when you believe that it can work. You know, that is the only answer I can give, because it's pure intuition there, where I know that such a large detail in a project can do the whole job of a project, whereby maybe 3 or 4 elements do the job. You know, I'm over the years I've learned that if you place 20 ambitions in a project, then the project will never work. But if there are only 3, then it will work. And on a master plan like that, I needed maybe only 5.
Thank you, Ben and Hernan, for the nice presentation and the discussion. I have been thinking about, on the one hand, like the train station and all the infrastructural, let's say, part related with the contemporary city. We're at the moment of an urban growth where infrastructure will become important. And at the same time, I have been thinking about the 20 years that Hernan has been talking about, and about the time of the architectural production. So you have been mentioning that we are at a moment that our lives are changing, not so much about the iPhone and the digital technologies, but mainly because mentalities are changing. Mentalities about properties, the way that we inhabit the space. So the way that we use public transportation or mobility. And I have the sensation that infrastructure is changing and will be changing radically. Like sharing cars, maybe self-driven cars, or even a combination of other kind of vehicles that we are not even imagining at the moment. So my question is, whereas the architectural discipline and whereas the architects would still have some power in the way that they could influence the way that we are building the infrastructure or our spaces to have a capacity to mutate in the future, or let's say in the time. And I'm saying that because I'm coming from Barcelona and I see people struggling for a project, no? They just want to take a project in whichever part of the world and design it, but they can hardly have the time and the space to brainstorm of what would that space be in 10 years' time, especially at the moment that everything is changing like so quickly. So do you see that happening do you see that we've lost this, let's say, possibility? Can we be able as architects to design more adaptive spaces? Do we still have the power within this economical, social, environmental crisis to do so?
Yes, I do believe that. Yeah, for instance, I'm looking at the ring road of Amsterdam right now in Holland, because the city of Amsterdam said to me, you know, we believe that we will all in Holland in 15 years drive for 80% electric cars. So 15 years, 20 years. and they ask us to look at the way how that will influence the value of the ground. What is the city's ground around the railroad? Around the ring road of the city, because then there will be less sound. There will be more opportunity to activate these grounds. Maybe it would be much nicer suddenly to live there or to work there, whereas these grounds are often quite they're not empty. And I find that I'm happy that I'm asked for these questions, because maybe over the years I've shown that you have to have as an architect, you need to have an fascination for engineering and the statistics around numbers, and that's what mobility is often about. For instance, we do now in Qatar so many stations, around 2 or 3 metro lines, and the original competition drawings were already done by 3 engineering officers, who all, top engineering officers, and I was quite critical. I discovered when we were while we were working on the competition, we discovered that escalators were all in the wrong place because they didn't show any form of flexibility. And I'm not talking here about a kind of form of arrogance you have to be so critical, but to look at where you can optimize and edit information of the engineers. And I think that's maybe also an answer to earlier questions. I do think that if you work with the complex parametric aspects of information, then it's not so more important to collect that information, what I said also today, but to connect that information and to be a very good editor in that. The adaptability of the Arnhem train station is all in there. There is a full belief that that in the future we will have only one screen in the station where you can see all the information of all the transport entities within the station, and we are working on that already, so that you can see what time the buses are leaving, what time, or who is coming into the car park, so that you know already that your friend is driving into the car park on one screen, and that you can mutate that information in the central area where everyone is also waiting, so that you don't have now as where there are 3 screens in the station. So I do believe that you're right. I don't like to call it the smart world or the Internet of Things who are influencing more intensely now architecture. I think it's going to be the most exciting aspect of the way how architecture will have to adapt itself towards that new phenomenon.
So very quick, my last one, and then we close, is since we're in school and you've been heading the Stadtschule for so long, and then Princeton and Harvard, all the places that you teach, how close do you think right now the discipline of the profession are in terms of what you develop as a teacher or the head of the institute and your own practice? How close we are, how apart we should be? Should the school, which I'm kind of sympathetic to that idea in a way, shouldn't worry that much about the profession because the profession will take care of itself, or not?
No, I think that I've experienced it myself in the 80s at the AA. It was the best time ever, where we did the most unusual, crazy experiments. So I think that's inside of architecture what we should not lose. So schools are there to do the most unusual outside the practice. But sometimes, but I do believe that the opportunity of what you can do with specialists, for instance, are endless. I think that to find a way to play with that expansion of the practice. Also in education, I think it would be good. So that, let's say, the experimental on one side, that you stretch that up even more, but on the other hand, also that the aspect of engineering, the complex richness of engineering, that could be applied a bit more to education. I mean, I wish I could have applied that a bit better to the Städteschule, but I couldn't do that there because it's another type of school with another kind of attitude. But I wish I could experiment with these two aspects a bit more in education, yeah.
Ben, thank you. Congratulations on the new baby.
Yeah, thanks.